just when Robert F. Kennedy Jr. thought his lifelong dream was finally within reach, when the polls started to lean heavily in his favor, when the deafening cheers of supporters echoed through every rally hall, when the media buzzed with whispers of a political upset unlike any seen in decades, everything changed. In the blink of an eye, the tide turned. Before moving forward, first of all, you are new to our channel, please subscribe. For months, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. had defied every political prediction. When he first announced his campaign, the establishment barely took notice. Another Kennedy in the race, they said. The old guard dismissed him as a relic of a famous family trying to cash in on a fading name. But slowly, methodically, against all odds, he began to rise. It wasn't the Kennedy name that drew the crowds this time. It was his voice, his bold, defiant stance against corporate influence, his unflinching criticism of government overreach, his promise to tear down the systems that kept everyday Americans struggling while the elite grew richer. His message hit home in a way no one, not even his closest advisors, could have predicted. For the first time in decades, America felt the strange stirrings of hope from a candidate who wasn't afraid to speak what others wouldn't dare. People from every political background, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, even those who had given up on politics altogether, started to listen. The rallies grew larger. The chants grew louder. "Kennedy, Kennedy!" they shouted in cities, towns, and forgotten places where politicians rarely visited. Donations poured into his campaign coffers at record speed. His name climbed the charts of social media trends almost daily. Analysts on every network shook their heads in disbelief. "It's a political miracle," they muttered on primetime news. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the dark horse who just might steal this race. Polls showed him closing the gap. In some battleground states, he pulled ahead. His opponents, once confident and smug, began to worry. Their advisors held emergency meetings behind closed doors, wondering how a man they thought was irrelevant had suddenly become unstoppable. And Kennedy knew it. He could feel the wind at his back. Every handshake on the campaign trail felt electric. Every speech felt like prophecy. He was standing on the edge of history, ready to break the chains of old politics, ready to fulfill the dream that had haunted his family name since his father's tragic death decades earlier. But in politics, as in life, the higher you rise, the harder you fall, because all it takes is one file, one document, one truth, and for Robert F. Kennedy Jr., that truth had a name: Jasmine Crockett. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just another politician, she was a fighter, sharp, intelligent, unafraid of confrontation, a rising star in Washington's chaotic battlefield. Known for asking the questions others were too afraid to ask. Known for standing alone if necessary to speak the truth. While Kennedy's campaign soared, Crockett's team had been watching, silently, patiently. They weren't dazzled by his charisma. They didn't buy into the so-called Kennedy magic. Instead, they did what few others bothered to do in the era of quick headlines and viral soundbites. They dug. They searched old court records, federal files, dusty archives where forgotten truths sleep until someone wakes them. And after weeks of searching, they found what they were looking for: a file. It wasn't breaking news. It wasn't a fresh scandal. In fact, it was old, buried under years of reports and media forgetfulness. But in politics, old truths are like dry kindling. All you need is a spark to set the fire ablaze. The file contained traces of Kennedy's past dealings, environmental lawsuits, corporate contracts, business ties that quietly contradicted the clean, honest, anti-establishment image he sold to the public. Deals that, while legal, didn't fit the man who stood before crowds promising to fight for the little guy. Jasmine Crockett held that file in her hand. She read it carefully, every page, and she smiled, not with joy, but with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that truth, no matter how late it arrives, can still shake the world. She waited. She planned. She chose her moment with surgical precision, because this file, this small collection of facts forgotten by most, could do what no rival speech, no angry debate, no smear campaign had managed to do. It could break Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s unstoppable rise. And so, while Kennedy celebrated new poll numbers and growing crowds, his downfall was quietly, silently being prepared behind the scenes. A single file, a hidden truth, a storm waiting to break. No one, not even Kennedy himself, saw it coming, but Jasmine Crockett did, and soon, so would the entire nation. For most of his life, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. had lived under the weight of a towering legacy. A legacy built by his father, Robert F. Kennedy Sr., and his uncle, President John F. Kennedy. The Kennedy name echoed through the halls of American history like a myth tied to greatness, tragedy, promise, and loss. For years, that name had been both his greatest gift and his heaviest burden. People whispered that Robert Jr. could never truly escape that shadow. He's just another Kennedy, they said, part of a famous family but not a leader in his own right. Every attempt he made to step into the spotlight was met with doubt, suspicion, or the dismissive attitude that he was simply riding the coattails of his family's political dynasty. But this time was different. This time he wasn't running on the name. He was running on the message. When he stepped onto the national stage to announce his campaign for the presidency, few took him seriously. The pundits chuckled, the experts rolled their eyes. He's a long shot, they said, a distraction. But they didn't understand what millions of ordinary Americans had already seen, a man willing to speak out when others stayed silent. Kennedy wasn't afraid of the powerful. He took direct aim at Big Pharma, boldly accusing them of manipulating public health for profit. He questioned the honesty and motives of government agencies that most politicians feared to even mention. He spoke of corruption, greed, secrecy, and the forgotten millions who paid the price while the rich and well-connected thrived, and the people, tired, angry, disillusioned, listened. His rallies began small, a few hundred in modest town halls. But word spread fast. Videos of his fiery speeches went viral. Clips of him hammering home uncomfortable truths lit up social media feeds. Soon the halls were packed. Then came the stadiums. The media, which once mocked him, had to turn its cameras his way. A movement is building, they finally admitted. Kennedy's numbers are rising faster than anyone expected. Even his harshest critics in Washington couldn't deny the truth. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was no longer the side note in someone else's story. He was now a serious contender for the highest office in the land. Polls showed him closing the gap against long-time political giants. Donations from small supporters, truck drivers, teachers, veterans, nurses poured in like a flood. The ET public was hungry for someone who spoke plainly, who refused to play the usual Washington game. And Kennedy gave them that in every sentence, every pause, every promise. The more he spoke, the more he seemed unstoppable. The energy of his campaign felt raw, wild, electric, a kind of force that few politicians ever achieve. He was not polished. He was not perfect. But he was real. And in a world full of politicians reading safe lines from teleprompters, that made all the difference. But as the bright spotlight of public adoration surrounded him, somewhere in the shadows of Washington, D.C., another figure was watching, quietly, carefully, waiting, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. To the public, Crockett was respected, a fierce defender of truth, justice, and transparency. But behind the scenes, she was something else entirely, a strategist, a thinker, someone who understood the true rules of power. She didn't believe in luck. She didn't believe in miracles. She believed in facts, files, records, paper trails. And Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s trail, she suspected, was longer and dirtier than the public knew. While the cameras followed Kennedy's every rally and every speech, Crockett's team worked in silence. They combed through archives no one bothered to open. They read court documents others had forgotten. They hunted for the gap between Kennedy's promises and his past, because in politics, such gaps always exist. And then they found something. A file. Old, faded, but dangerous. A piece of truth waiting to be used. As Kennedy smiled for cameras and waved to roaring crowds, Crockett sat in her quiet office, holding that file in her hand. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply thought, at the right time, this will end him. The public saw Kennedy's rise. The networks covered his speeches, his slogans, his promises of revolution. But they didn't see Crockett, silent, patient, preparing to strike with surgical precision. Because in the world of power, only two kinds of people survive: those who build their future and those who protect the truth. Jasmine Crockett knew which one she was, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr., for all his dreams of change, was about to learn that the past has a way of catching up. No matter how high you climb, no matter how loud the crowd, no matter how close you stand to victory, the file was waiting, and so was she. Jasmine Crockett was no stranger to the brutal games of Washington politics. In fact, she thrived in them. A rising star in the House of Representatives, Crockett had built her reputation not by playing safe, but by speaking truths others were too afraid to touch. She was fierce, unflinching, and unapologetically direct. A rare kind of leader in a city full of cautious wordsmiths and spin doctors. What made her stand out, however, wasn't just her fire in front of the cameras. It was her mind. Razor-sharp, calculating, patient. Behind every passionate speech and bold statement was a carefully laid plan. Crockett never moved without a purpose. She never spoke without a strategy, and when she chose to strike, it was never by accident. For weeks, while the nation was distracted by Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s soaring campaign, Crockett's team worked in quiet darkness. No headlines, no tweets, no leaks. Just methodical research. They weren't looking for gossip or cheap scandal. Those fade fast in the 24-hour news cycle. They wanted something real, something undeniable, something that couldn't be spun or explained away. And then they found it, a file. At first glance it seemed ordinary, an old government document, half forgotten in the archives. But as her team dug deeper, the contents unfolded like pages of buried history. There they were, traces of past lawsuits. Environmental cases where companies Kennedy had once been involved with were accused of pollution, regulatory violations, and questionable practices. There were quiet settlements, never widely reported. There were business connections that raised uncomfortable questions about his claims of being free from corporate influence. The file wasn't fresh. It wasn't breaking news. But that made it more dangerous. Because old truths, when brought into the harsh light of the present, burn hotter than any rumor or allegation. They stick. They haunt. Crockett knew this. She had spent years watching careers fall not from scandalous mistakes, but from facts that resurfaced at the worst possible moment. And this file, was the perfect weapon. Her aides stood around, her desk in silence as she slowly flipped through the pages, reading line by line. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The importance of what they'd uncovered hung heavy in the room. "This is it," she finally said, breaking the silence. "This is how the story changes." But Crockett wasn't reckless. She didn't rush to leak the file to the press. She didn't blast it across social media or call for a press conference. No, that wasn't her style. In politics, the timing of a strike is just as deadly as the strike itself. The right truth, delivered at the wrong time, can fade without consequence. She needed the perfect moment, The moment when every camera in the country was aimed at Robert F. Kennedy Jr., when every reporter was watching his every word, when the nation's eyes were locked onto him, expecting him to shine. That moment, she knew, was coming soon. The next televised debate, it would be the grand stage. Millions tuning in. Supporters and skeptics alike holding their breath to see if Kennedy could carry his rising momentum into a victory. His opponents would ask the usual questions. The moderators would toss him softballs and curveballs. But none of them would see what Jasmine Crockett was about to deliver. She imagined it perfectly, the hush that would fall over the room as she calmly produced the file. The momentary confusion on Kennedy's face, the flicker of panic in his eyes, the silent gasp from the audience. A single document, small, simple but deadly, laid bare for the world to see. Crockett knew how Washington worked. Scandals could be denied. Accusations could be dismissed as lies. But facts on paper, records stamped by government agencies, those were harder to escape. Harder to explain away. Harder to forget. And Kennedy, for all his charisma and charm, would have no easy defense against what this file contained. But she waited. Patience was a weapon too. For days, she carried the file in her briefcase, like a quiet sword waiting to be unsheathed. She studied Kennedy's every move, his speeches, his promises, his assurances that he was the outsider candidate who owed no favors, who carried no stains of the old political world. Soon, she thought. Very soon. The debate stage would be the battlefield. And when the lights shone bright, when Kennedy smiled his confident smile, when the country held its breath, that's when she'd strike, and the shockwave would be felt not just in that room, but across America. One file, one moment, and the man who was about to make history would instead become history. Jasmine Crockett smiled to herself as she zipped the file back into her bag. The world wasn't ready, but it would be very soon. The debate was going perfectly for Robert F. Kennedy Jr. He stood on that grand stage under the blazing lights, his confidence unshakable, his charm fully alive. Every question that came his way, healthcare, the economy, foreign policy, government, corruption, he answered with the practiced ease of a man who had rehearsed these lines not just for days or weeks, but for years. His voice was steady. His gaze never flinched. The audience, a sea of curious voters, die-hard supporters, cautious skeptics, leaned in with growing admiration. Even the veteran journalists sitting in the press box exchanged quiet glances and whispered, "He's untouchable tonight." It was supposed to be the moment Kennedy crossed the line from interesting outsider to undeniable frontrunner. Every pollster predicted that if he survived this debate cleanly, his campaign would rocket forward, unstoppable, undeniable, and for the first 45 minutes, that prediction seemed true. Then came the moment no one, not even Kennedy, saw coming. From her seat on the opposite side of the stage, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett slowly rose. The audience shifted in their seats. The camera operators turned their lenses toward her. There was no anger in her face, no urgency in her voice, only deadly, surgical calm. "Mr. Kennedy," she said, her voice slicing through the hall like a blade, "would you care to explain this?" She held up a file, a simple folder, plain, official, stamped. Yet its presence in her hand shifted the energy of the entire room. Kennedy's smile stiffened. His confident posture faltered, just for a moment. But the cameras caught it. They caught everything. "What file?" Kennedy asked, masking the unease creeping into his voice. Crockett unfolded the papers and began to read, line by line, word by word, lawsuits, environmental violations, companies with Kennedy's name on the advisory board, settlements paid to silence pollution claims, regulatory warnings ignored by firms he was tied to. The list went on. The audience sat frozen. Not a cough, not a whisper. Even the moderators, seasoned anchors who'd seen hundreds of debates, said nothing. Their wide eyes stared at Crockett like the rest of America. Kennedy's expression cracked. His easy smile was gone. His hands, once resting coolly on the podium, now twitched, clutching its sides a little too tightly. "That's ancient history," he said, trying to force confidence into his crumbling voice. "Those cases were resolved years ago. I wasn't even directly involved in the operations. But it was too late." The moment was already alive, spreading like wildfire. Every camera in the room zoomed in. Every reporter frantically typed on their tablets. In that instant, before the debate even ended, headlines began flooding news sites, Kennedy's hidden past exposed, live on stage. Jasmine Crockett drops the file that could end Kennedy's run. The dark secrets of Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s business ties revealed. And then came the internet. Twitter exploded with clips of the moment. TikTok users were already chopping up the footage, adding dramatic music and captions. YouTube commentators scrambled to upload instant reactions. Millions watched the clip. On loop, Kennedy, blinking in confusion, trying to explain the file that was never supposed to surface. For Kennedy, the next hours were a nightmare unfolding in real time. His campaign managers whispered frantically backstage. His PR team blasted emails drafting statements they knew wouldn't work. His closest advisors sat pale-faced, understanding what their candidate didn't dare say aloud yet, that the damage was done, because no matter how old the file was, the story was new. New to the millions of voters who believed Kennedy was a clean outsider. New to the undecided Americans who had been leaning his way. New to the media, which smelled fresh scandal, the lifeblood of every news cycle. By dawn, the reality was unavoidable. Sponsors called to withdraw funding. Key endorsements vanished. Campaign staff began quietly handing in resignations. Donors held back their checks, and most importantly, the polls, once rising like a rocket, crashed. Support plummeted overnight. Talk shows roasted the Kennedy file scandal relentlessly. Memes filled every corner of the internet. Late night, comedians turned Kennedy's stammering excuses into punchlines. Worse still, his supporters, the people who had once chanted his name at rallies, now flooded his social media with betrayal. "How could you lie to us? I thought you were different." Another corrupt politician, just like the rest. No carefully written apology could fix it. No press conference could erase the images burned into the minds of millions. He had been so close to history, so close to breaking free of the Kennedy curse and forging his own destiny. But in politics, you are only as good as your hidden past. And Kennedy's past, forgotten in some quiet government office for years, had finally found the light. And Jasmine Crockett was the one who lit the match. With a single file, she ended the campaign that was supposed to change America. Overnight, the man who was meant to win became the man who lost everything. The next morning, as the sun rose over Washington, D.C., Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s campaign office was not its usual hive of energy. There were no ringing phones, no excited chatter, no busy footsteps of aides rushing between desks. There was only silence, a heavy, suffocating silence that settled over the room like a fog. The big flat-screen televisions, usually showing favorable news clips or poll updates, were turned off. The computers sat idle. Half-empty coffee cups and wrinkled speech drafts lay untouched across the desks. A stack of unused Kennedy 2024 posters leaned sadly against the wall. Some staffers hadn't even shown up. Others gathered in quiet corners, whispering in low voices, shaking their heads. Some stared at their phones, reading the flood of headlines and social media posts that had filled the digital world overnight. Kennedy's campaign in crisis. Jasmine Crockett's file. Bombshell. Is this the end for RFK Jr.? Support for Kennedy plummets after debate expose. Sponsors. Some of his biggest financial backers had already made their calls. Their messages were firm, apologetic, but final. Funding was suspended. Promised donations were withdrawn. Endorsements crumbled just as quickly. Local leaders and celebrities who had once proudly attached their names to Kennedy's campaign now rushed to distance themselves. Statements were issued, carefully worded to sever ties without causing backlash. And the voters, oh, the voters. The people who had cheered him only days before were now silent, or worse, angry. His campaign's email inbox overflowed with disappointed messages. We believed you were different. Another fake, another liar. You promised honesty, and now this? On social media, the backlash was brutal. Hashtags like Dire Kennedy lied and Dire Filegate trended worldwide. Every platform, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, was flooded with clips of the moment Jasmine Crockett held up that file. The still image of Kennedy's stunned, speechless face was already becoming a meme, shared millions of times with captions like, "When your past catches up," and "End of the Kennedy dream." Kennedy himself sat behind closed doors in his private office. His advisors, those few who hadn't already fled, gathered around him, tense and grim. "We can fix this," one whispered. "Let's release a statement. Deny the allegations. Blame old business partners. Say you had no direct involvement." Another suggested. Kennedy's reply was hollow, barely audible. "It won't matter," he said, staring blankly at the wall. "They saw the file. They heard it all. The damage is done." And he was right. No amount of spin could erase the truth that Jasmine Crockett had unleashed in front of the entire nation. While Kennedy's camp struggled to hold together the last crumbling pieces of a once great campaign, Crockett's star rose like a rocket. The morning shows praised her courage. Political commentators, even those who disagreed with her on everything, nodded in reluctant respect. It was bold, they said, risky, but she did what others wouldn't. She told the truth when it mattered most. On the streets, in coffee shops, in offices across America, people talked about her. "Did you see her last night?" She exposed him. She stood alone, didn't back down. That took guts. Finally, someone who doesn't play by the rules of silence. But Crockett herself remained calm, unmoved by the flood of praise. She didn't smile. She didn't take a victory lap on social media. There was no gloating, no mocking her fallen opponent. When a reporter cornered her outside her office that morning and asked why she'd done it, why she chose to drop the file bomb that destroyed Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s campaign, her answer was simple, clear, and cold as steel. The people deserve to know the truth, no matter who it hurts. No drama, no performance, just that. And that was what made it even more powerful. For her, this wasn't personal. It wasn't about fame. It was about the principle. That truth, no matter how old or buried, has the right to live in the light. And so it was that Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s dream, the dream of rising out from the Kennedy shadow, of winning the presidency not because of his name, but because of his ideas, ended not with a vote, not with a scandalous affair, not with a campaign gaffe, but with a single forgotten file, a simple folder, resurrected at the perfect moment by someone who refused to stay silent. For Kennedy, the fall was swift and complete. His vision of victory turned to ashes. His promises of change faded into whispers of regret. And Jasmine Crockett stood tall, not as a destroyer, but as a guardian of uncomfortable truth. In the ruthless game of politics, it was a brutal reminder to every candidate in America. No secret stays buried forever. Not in this town. Not when someone like Jasmine Crockett is watching.